Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 12 of the Bible by the Week. If you have made it this far with us, you are almost a quarter of the way through the scriptures. Good job. We are in Deuteronomy this week, starting with Deuteronomy 17. We're going to complete Deuteronomy. We're going to take a look at a psalm that is traditionally attributed to Moses, because this is the final instructions of Moses that we're going to be covering as the people prepare to enter the promised land. And then we will actually get into a little bit of Joshua, a little bit of the actual crossing of the Jordan and the beginning of the conquest of the promised land. So let's dive in. I find it very interesting. Actually, it's not the action-packed type of thing, but Deuteronomy is very conversational, and Moses gives instruction on a variety of laws that have influenced the way that we think about what God desires for us and how human society ought to function, especially with regard to justice and protecting the vulnerable. So, taking a look at Deuteronomy 17, Moses is continuing, of course, to talk about God's works and his instructions. He reminds the Israelites, first of all, in this chapter, that they are to give the Lord their best, their first fruits, not the leftovers, and not tolerate idolatry. You've probably noticed how often this theme comes through in Deuteronomy, especially because this is the reason that God raised up the Israelites, is that they would worship the true God and make him known to the nations. So they can't tolerate any idolatry, any false worship. And difficult court cases that they can't adjudicate themselves are referred to the priests, because it is a theocracy. That is, God is actually the final arbiter of the law. He's the one who they are trying to please. That's the basis of their society, not a constitution, not a human personality, but God is their king. If they do want a king, interesting little caveat in here that Moses anticipates that the people will want a king, because that's what the other nations have. If they do want a king, he has to be an Israelite. He is not to collect horses or wives. Why is that? Well, because the horses were the tank, the all-purpose military vehicle, and so nations would try to accumulate horses and chariots as the Egyptians did. That would make them a military power. But the Israelites were not to rely on the strength of their military. They were to rely on God to protect them. Similar thing actually with wives. This was not necessarily about lust. Kings had lots of wives because they would marry the daughters of other kings. And because of that family tie, it was thought to produce stability. I mean, you're not actually going to attack my family's nation, are you? And so this was kind of the diplomatic way that nations were tied together through multiple wives given to kings. Not so in Israel. Not only are they supposed to depend on God, but God has made it very clear that he created male and female to be one male, one female, not to have a power imbalance, to have different roles, but that they were to be in an exclusive union. And of course, there is provision made a little later on in Deuteronomy for divorce. We'll get to that in a minute. The Levites, it's reiterated, they are not going to inherit a homeland that is like a county or a state of their own. They're going to have cities spread throughout the various tribal lands, and they are the recipients of the offerings given to God. That's to sustain them and to sustain the worship life of the nation. The following chapter, or the rest of the chapter 18, speaks about a variety of issues. First of all, along with idolatry, many of these nations practice child sacrifice, and not just in the Mediterranean. Of course, we find lots of evidence that among the Incas and people in what we call the New World, very common in ancient times and abhorrent to God, who values all people. No sorcery or spiritism. This is completely not allowed. Again, it's occult worship is false worship. Even though there is an enemy of God, you certainly are not to worship God's enemy. Um, God is going to raise up a prophet like Moses. This is a key promise in Deuteronomy that people in the New Testament are well aware of. And when we get to the New Testament, we'll run into this idea. People are asking Jesus if he is the prophet predicted by Moses. And of course, he is the ultimate prophet predicted by Moses. There were many prophets before Jesus that represented God and proclaimed his word. Jesus was the ultimate one. Um, then an interesting part here in this chapter 18, false prophets are not to be tolerated. In fact, they are to be killed. And how do you know if they're a false prophet? If anything they predict doesn't come true. And when we get into the prophets later on in the Old Testament, the prophets themselves, the ones from God, will say, "Test me. If it's not true, kill me." Um, and this makes you wonder about, the predictions that psychics make each year that are published about what their predictions are for the coming year. And I think the best of them has about an 11% accuracy rate, but I don't see people lining up to kill them. That would be a violation of our laws. But if we were ancient Israel, we wouldn't have people making those predictions at the beginning of the year unless they came from God, because the punishment for a false prediction would be stoning. In chapter 19, it talks about these cities of refuge we've talked about that are spread. They are Levitical cities that are spread, 6 of them, throughout the nation of Israel. And these are places where someone can flee for justice, to have their case heard, because Israel was coming out of tribal justice, which was very much a vigilante system. So rather than having an opportunity to prove their innocence, people would just be killed by the other tribe or the other clan when they had committed a serious crime. So these cities of refuge are set up as a place where they can go to be safe until their trial is held. It's not to avoid justice, it's basically to allow for justice. Um, 2 to 3 witnesses. We hear this quoted a lot in the New Testament. It's part of the whole system of Hebrew justice that everything must be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. It can't be just one person's word against another person's word. There have to be at least 2 witnesses, preferably 3, to establish what the truth is in a situation. In chapter 20, it's explicitly said God's people shouldn't fear larger armies because the Lord is going to fight for them. There's an interesting provision here. If you have a brand new home that you haven't lived in, or a new farm that's yours, or a new fiance, and later on a new wife, you are exempt from military service, at least for a year, so that you can enjoy God's gifts, which is, incredibly merciful. And you don't find this in drafts of other nations later on earth, even in modern times. Um, and again, this is a matter of trust in God. Israel is told that they can offer peace treaties to distant cities, but not to cities within the promised land. Why is that? Because if these people aren't driven out completely, they are going to tempt Israel to intermarriage with false gods and idolatry. And we still find this to this day. People who have the same faith background, the same strength of faith, when they marry, there's a very good chance that their children will be raised in that faith. But if they marry in 2 different faiths, then generally the children will have no faith. Maybe they'll pick one parent's faith or another. It depends on how the parents work it out. But it's much less effective in passing on the faith when there's marriage to someone who has a different faith. So this is prohibited in Israel. And let me see, where are we here? The atonement, chapter 21. Atonement has to be made for unsolved murders. And they didn't have DNA evidence or that type of thing. And this would be made by the nearest town, assuming that each town is responsible for justice and for protection of people in their area. There's no explicit police force per se, but every Israelite is responsible for justice. So if someone is killed near your town, then you have to atone for that. You share in some of the blame for not providing safety for those people within your area. Women taken captive because they're going to be conquering and fighting wars against Canaanite groups, they can be married. What can't happen is they cannot, an Israelite could marry them, if they are willing to, become Israelite, to join the faith. What they can't do, though, is decide that they don't like that woman or that they like someone else and then make that wife a slave. That is not allowed. They have a certain dignity, even women of the enemies of Israel. There's provision in this chapter for firstborn sons. I should explain there was no social security system. Why were firstborn sons privileged? Because they were responsible for the welfare of the parents when they aged. And this was so they received a double blessing, a double portion of the inheritance. And this had to be true, even if it was if a man married two wives, which wasn't God's will because of obvious problems. But if he had married two wives, even if the firstborn son is the son of one that the father favored less. And remember, this was a problem prior to actually in the development of Israel, in the children of Jacob or the children of Israel, that he had two wives, one that he wanted to marry and another that he got tricked into marry. And the one that he got tricked into marry was the first one to give him sons. And so, Jacob, he, because of his favoritism for Joseph and Joseph's sons, this created huge problems in family dynamics that lasted and continue to last really in the history of Israel. So that is explicitly denied in the law of God. It's not allowed. There are some other protections here. Let me see. Firstborn sons can't be denied their double portion. Rebellious sons, on the other hand, can be taken before the elders and stoned to death. Why? Again, because even though God respects the personhood of every person, remember that one of the first and foremost commandments is honor your father and mother. And anyone who doesn't honor their father and mother is undermining the very fabric of Israelite society. And this cancer can't be allowed to infect or metastasize into the Israelite community. So, typical American teen rebellion would absolutely not be tolerated because Israel, they didn't have the privilege of messing with this, and because the relationship a person has with their parents is going to color their relationship with God, and so they can't tolerate this. On the other hand, parents aren't allowed to be vigilantes. They have to bring the child before the entire community, because the community is going to know whether this is a youth who's worth saving or whether this youth is actually a threat to the community. Interesting passage here that's quoted in the New Testament, and again, here is chapter 21, and that is, cursed is anyone who is hung on a tree. They can use hanging as a means of killing people who are guilty. There is capital punishment. What they can't do is leave that person hanging on a tree, which was very common for ancient peoples, to put someone's head on a pike or leave them hanging outside town. The Romans did this too with crosses. They would leave the bodies hanging on the cross as a warning. But that was a curse, and no Israelite should have to bear that kind of curse. So they were to be buried right away. Why does this show up in the New Testament? Because, of course, Jesus was hung on a cross, and this is him taking on the curse of our sin. There are laws in chapter 22 about being willing to help a neighbor with their animal. Animals were valuable, and the Israelites were actually kinder to their animals and had more provision for their animals in their law than other nations. This extends even to a mother bird, that if you're hungry and you want to rob the nest, you can do that, but don't kill the mother bird. This is just good ecology, isn't it? Allowing that mother bird to go on and reproduce and produce more. And it's a kinder way to treat even wild animals. There is the infamous, in our time, laws against a woman dressing like a man and a man dressing like a woman. Why? Because God created us male and female. Male and female, he created us, and he intends us to be that way. And I'm sorry, if you're dissatisfied with your particular sex or gender, God's law does not allow you to defy God and to change. That doesn't mean that there aren't women who, especially from time to time in biblical history, take on the role like Deborah did of a judge and go out with the armies of Israel. And it doesn't mean that you can't have women who are very strong and assertive and so on. And it doesn't mean that men have to carry the burden of this machismo ethic, where they can't be sensitive. We find, even King David, the great general of Israel's army, is incredibly sensitive. He's a musician, and he has a very close relationship with his best friend Jonathan, who ought to be his enemy. It doesn't mean men are to be insensitive oafs, or that women don't have strength. But it does mean that we don't veto God's idea of gender. This doesn't mean that, by the way, in the New Testament, that people like the early Christians didn't have empathy for example, eunuchs and so on. They very much did, more so than under Israel laws. But it does mean that we continue to insist on the complementary nature of the genders, not placing one over the other, even for our own personal comfort level. Let me see, where were we? There are laws here to protect those who visit you and go up on your roof, because they had flat roofs, and this was, you were supposed to create a parapet, a guardrail, if you would, around your roof. This was a safety regulation. There are laws about virgins being protected from slander. If a man claims that he doesn't like his wife because she wasn't a virgin when they got married, he better be able to prove it. And there was, a bit of an iffy, but a way that parents could show, no, our daughter was a virgin. This man's slandering her, and he needs to continue to be married to her. We made an arrangement. Remember that these were generally arranged marriages between the parents. So it was something that concerned the entire community. And it was a protection, because men held the upper hand in strength. They would hold the upper hand in terms of making claims one-on-one. But again, there was a burden of proof that had to be shown that the woman wasn't a virgin when she was married. It was considered to be a very important thing for the purity of Israel. You find in communal groups where they live closely together. For example, when I was in China, I found this, that they couldn't believe the immorality of Christian youth, that they would sleep together before the commitment of marriage. Because when I was there, they just didn't have that opportunity. They didn't have their own cars. They didn't go out by themselves when they went out, even dancing and and partying and so on. They always went out in mixed groups. They didn't have the one-on-one time that we, for some reason, allow our teens, which encourages hormones to go crazy. It was understood that that marriage was primarily for raising healthy children for the benefit of the community. It wasn't my own personal pleasure that was foremost. So, virgins are protected, but adulterers are stoned to death. Remember, Jesus famously defends a woman caught in the act of adultery because of the injustice of that situation. Nonetheless, it's considered extremely serious in Israel if people are having sex outside of marriage, either fornication as a form of adultery or adultery between two spouses. So the assembly of the Lord prohibits deformities, and why is that? Well, it's because of the purity and the perfection that the tabernacle represents, and also enemies aren't allowed in the tabernacle. That is, certain nations, the Moabites and so on, who had done Israel wrong. And this was actually a problem potentially for King David's grandmother, who was Ruth, who was from Moab, because the Moabites were among those who hadn't let the Israelites pass, had gone out and attacked them and tried to defeat their fulfillment of the promises that God had given them. So we have regulations on keeping the camp of the Israelites pure and holy, and that even includes the privy. The Israelites were among the earliest to bury their excrement And certainly this had health benefits. It certainly made the camp smell better. But the reason that's given is because God dwells among the Israelites, so everything has to be pure and holy. Slaves are to be welcomed among the Israelites. That is, they are not to bring slaves back. If somebody runs to them for refuge and they desire to join the Israelite community, they're allowed to do that. Um, Prostitutes, however, especially ritual prostitution as part of pagan worship, that is completely not allowed. And usury, charging interest to fellow Israelites, is not allowed. Now, they can charge interest to other nations, but not to fellow Israelites. Um, Let me see, where else are we? Vows have to be kept before God. Also, interesting law here, gleaning is not only allowed but encouraged. That is, when you harvest your crops, your vineyard or whatever, you don't go back and pick every grape. You allow them to be picked by those who are poor, who are having a bad year. It's a way that they can work for their food if their own crops have failed, or say, they somehow have lost access to their family's ancestral lands. This was, and there were a number of provisions for the poor in these laws of Israel. Notice divorce is allowed for cause, not no fault divorce like we have now in our country. If there is cause, if the man, and this was a great issue in the time of Jesus that Jesus comments on, the Pharisees come to and ask, is it right for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And Jesus says, no, not for any and every reason. There are specific reasons that are allowed, not encouraged, but allowed. So I'll be talking about that probably more when we get to the Gospels. And so divorce for cause is allowed. Remarriage after a second marriage. So if a man divorces his wife and she marries someone else and then gets divorced again, she can't go back and marry the first husband. Even though I've seen this in a Christian church, this is prohibited by the law of Moses. I don't think the elders caught it at that church. Again, newlyweds are allowed to have a break from military service when they're first married, so that they can enjoy each other. Um, in uh, you know, where are we here? Aliens are protected in Israel. They are allowed to be part of the nation of Israel and protected. Also, there are protections for children in Israel. Now, as I said, a rebellious son could be stoned to death, but there are also some protections for children. Floggings are allowed, but they can't exceed 40 lashes, and that's why the Israelites at the time of Jesus had 40 lashes minus one. In case they miscounted, they would generally not flog someone more than 39 lashes. Oxen have to be allowed to eat when they are treading out the grain. Otherwise, it's cruelty to make them tread out the grain, and they can't stop and take a bite to give themselves energy. Paul applies this actually to pastors, that pastors are worth receiving payment for what they do, even though Paul doesn't do this. He says it's only right. He foresees that in order for them to give their full time to feeding the congregation, that pastors themselves need to be fed, as it were. Then there's an interesting thing called Levitical or Levirate marriage. And that is not Levitical, Levirate. And that is that if a man dies before he has given his wife a male offspring to carry on the family name, the brother of that man is obligated to marry that wife and give her an heir. That is, give her a male son. And we will find out in the case of Judah that he didn't do this, and he was really breaking the law because this was the obligation, because God wanted every woman to be protected by a male offspring and not lose the inheritance of the family that she and her husband had created. So this was something that was part of the law. It sounds kind of weird to us, but that's because we aren't functioning the way Israel was, and we have other ways of making a living besides the land, and it's just a different situation. So let me see. The And it's interesting in that, by the way, that if the brother refuses to do this, the woman publicly takes off his sandal and spits in his face. To this day, touching the sandal is considered unclean in the Holy Land. So you might know in a mosque, you take off your sandals. And you might remember when the president of the United States was visiting the Middle East, and to show displeasure, someone in the crowd threw their sandal at him. It's still considered incredibly insulting, as it might be if you're walking through pathways and streets that are covered with animal dung. So uh, the women, if a man gets in a fight, his wife is not allowed to punch him in the genitals or bite him in the genitals. They have to respect that. Speaking of respect, the weights and measures have to be fair and accurate, so that you can't use a lighter set of weights when you're giving grain to someone else and a heavier set when you're getting grain for them. You can't steal in that way. Moses goes on, chapter 26, talking about the first fruits, the tithes, and the offerings to support not only the Levites, by the way, but also the poor. Chapter 27, God tells the people that when they reach the Holy Land, when they climb up on Mount Ebal, they should create an altar of uncut stone and pronounce curses on those who are disobey God's law. Some people think that every covenant made with Israel by God is an unconditional covenant. That's not true at all. The covenants with Israel here are conditioned on their obedience, and there are blessings pronounced for obedience and curses for disobedience. Chapter 9, at Moab, they renew this covenant, and they recount what God has done, and these blessings and curses are announced. In chapter 30, God promises again to gather and forgive his people when they repent. But on the other hand, if they don't repent, then they will suffer the consequences. So this is really described as life or death. God is offering them life for obedience and death for disobedience, very literally, when they start to conquer the promised land. Joshua is ordained as the leader following Moses of the people. Moses has written down the book of the law, and so it's going to be contained in the Ark of the Covenant, along with the other things we've mentioned that are there. And every 7 years, Israel is to read out the law of God in a solemn assembly that everyone is to attend. Do they actually obey this law? It's thought that only in the time of Joshua did they do this. When he died, they no longer do. In chapter 32, Moses recites a song before the people about God's character and the covenant that they have received and how blessed they are. It's very poignant that before he dies, he creates this song to put into verse how blessed they are and to encourage their obedience. He pronounces his final blessings in chapter 33 on the various tribes of Israel. And then 34, on Mount Nebo, Moses dies and is buried by God. And there is this statement that the people mourn him, and it concludes with great honor given to Moses because of everything that God used him to do. Now, at this point, we stop and read the first of the Psalms, Psalm 90, and that's because this psalm is traditionally attributed to Moses, and it certainly reflects his thinking. You may have had in your reading Psalm 91. I apologize for that. There are two different ways to number some of the Psalms because of their arrangement over time, and sometimes that confuses the Psalms by being off by a number. So if on your copy of the paper it said Psalm 91, I apologize. It should have been Psalm 90. It's Moses' prayer for mercy, but also citing God's timeless strength. It's often read at funerals, by the way. It talks about the day, Lord numbering our days, and how time for him 1,000 years are like a day in his sight, and so on. It's very appropriate. Now let's get to Joshua. The Lord, at the beginning of Joshua, encourages him to be strong and courageous. He promises Joshua, that he's going to be with him as he had been with Moses. And interestingly enough, Joshua is kind of a type of Jesus. Not surprising, because Joshua's name in Hebrew is Yeshua. What's Jesus' name in Hebrew? Yeshua means the Lord is salvation. And Joshua is kind of a type, the deliverer, the one who conquers the promised land for Israel. He reminds Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. We don't know how much time has gone by, but he reminds them that they have taken an oath that they will help their brothers fight and conquer the land west of the Jordan. The people promised to obey Joshua as they've obeyed Moses, which is a little bit of cold comfort, or not reassuring, because they weren't always obedient to Moses either. He sends out spies in this famous story to spy out the first great fortress city that they have to cross or conquer just on the other side of the Jordan, and that is the city of Jericho. And famously, there is a lady who owns and operates a hotel where travelers can find comfort, who takes in these spies and actually hides them on her roof, which is also up against the city wall when they're found out, when it's rumor spreads that there are spies from another country. And so they escape through a window that faces into and is part of the city wall. And for that, when Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, which was actually God fighting the Battle of Jericho, because all they did was marched around the city for 7 days and then blew trumpets, and the walls collapsed, allowing them to conquer Jericho. Rahab, this madam, and her family are saved, and they are actually not only incorporated into Israel, they worship Israel's God and so on, but she is one of the ancestors of Jesus, according to his genealogy. So it's a kind of an amazing story. Chapter 3 in Joshua, they follow the ark of the Lord, cross over the Jordan on dry ground. And this, of course, confirms that Joshua is the legitimate successor of Moses, who led them out of Egypt on dry ground. Now Joshua leads them across the Jordan on dry ground. They cross over, and the first thing they do is they set up 12 stones that they've taken from the river as a memorial to God's provision as they enter into the promised land. So that brings us up to speed on their conquest of the promised land, and we'll be reading more about that as we get through Joshua. Thanks for your comments and questions, and for your participation in this reading, or at least watching through the Bible. The Lord bless you as you continue to dig into his word.